Sometimes people decide to allow themselves to fall. And then they try to use their falling as an excuse for not making a responsible decision. Sometimes people decide to walk around with their head up in the clouds, or their head stuck in the sand, or with blinders on, or with rose-colored glasses on, so they can fall. Sometimes people decide to refuse to learn, to grow up and to mature, so they can fall. Sometimes people decide to walk in darkness so they can fall. They decide to walk in late night darkness when they ought to be at home. They decide to walk in undercover darkness when they ought to be walking in the light. They decide to walk in not knowing God darkness when they ought to be seeking and hungering and thirsting after Him. Now, I have taken this detour to come back to the road and say that people are deciding to fall. Instead of deciding to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. Instead of deciding to be wooed and pursued by God's amazing love and His wonderful, marvelous grace, and instead of deciding to receive God's gift of uniting or being married to His Son Jesus as the church, and being forever blessed by His omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent goodness and faithfulness and integrity and wisdom and power and industriousness and diligence and patience and kindness and forgiveness and love and concern for others and holiness. Here in our day, we like to give rings with precious stones in them as tokens of our love. And we like to think that the more expensive the ring and the bigger the stone, then the greater the love. But the truth is, the rings and the stones that we can give are of very, very little value when compared with all that God has given us in the eternal gift of His Son. My brothers and sisters, the text says that Jesus Christ loved the church and gave Himself for it. Christ always has been and always will be loving the church. Even while it was yet in the mind of God, before it became visible, Christ was loving the church. Those who would decide to believe in Him and love Him and unite with Him and give themselves to Him and live for Him. And Jesus loved the church so much that He gave Himself for her. And like any bridegroom, Jesus desires to have a virtuous bride. A bride who will be compatible with Him. A bride who will be faithful and keep only unto Him. a bride who will have no others before him, a bride who will follow his leadership, a bride who will reverence him. But Jesus could not find a bride like that. No such bride existed. So Jesus had to create his own bride. Jesus had to create a body that he could be one with. And her name is the church. And she is the body of Christ. As Eve was created of Adam, so is the church created of Christ. As Adam looked at Eve and said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh," speaking of their oneness, Jesus looks at his bride, the church, and says our relationship is so much closer and so much stronger than even that of a husband and a wife. According to the Bible, my brothers and sisters, the relationship of husband and wife is to be closer and stronger than that of even parents and their children. And the relationship of Christ and his bride, the church, is to be the closest and the strongest of all relationships. Christ loved the church so much that he gave himself for her, that he might win her and continue to have her and continue to give himself to her. But first, Jesus needed to create his own bride. He could not find one, so he had to create one. Jesus is holy and without sin, so he had to create a bride that he could be one with. And he started by leaving his father and coming into this world and giving himself to pay the penalty for all our sin. And that was just the beginning. Jesus did not come just to pay the penalty for our sin. That was not the completion of his work. Just as importantly, Jesus also came to remove the filth and the stench and the pollution of sin that is in us and on us. You see, my brothers and sisters, Jesus cannot take unto himself a bride that has even the slightest trace of sin. Jesus cannot take home and present to his Father a bride whose garments are not whiter than snow. Jesus loved the church so much that he gave himself for her. And as the text says, that he might also sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. Jesus desires a bride that he might set her apart from the world to live a Christian life.